The summer of 1971 arrived in Mississippi like a fever that would not break. It came down on the delta in sheets of white heat, pressing the cotton fields flat against the horizon, turning the dirt roads into rivers of dust that rose behind every truck and settled again slow and patient, like something that had all the time in the world. It came down on the tin roof of the Cosgrove farmhouse, where a young woman named Nora stood on the porch her father had built with his own hands, looking out at 300 acres of land that no longer remembered how to give anything back. She was 24 years old. She had her father's eyes gray as rain clouds, and her mother's stubborn jaw, though her mother had been gone 11 years now, taken by a winter pneumonia that the doctors in town never quite explained. And 3 days ago, she had buried her father, Garland Cosgrove, in the small cemetery behind the Baptist church where 3 generations of Cosgroves already slept beneath the red clay. She had not cried at the funeral. She had stood very straight in her black dress, the only one she owned, that wasn't already patched at the elbow, and listened to the preacher talk about a man who had worked the land faithfully, who had never asked for more than what God provided. The men of the county had nodded along, hats in their hands, faces creased like old leather from 40 summers of sun. They had known Garland Cosgrove as a quiet man, a tired man, a man whose yields had shrunk every year since the war, until the bank had started sending letters with red stamps on the envelopes. What they did not know, what only Nora would come to know, was that her father had spent his last years not failing but watching, listening, writing. The drive home from the cemetery that day had been silent, just her and the truck, and 300 acres waiting at the end of the road for a decision she did not yet know she would have to make. Several of the men from the funeral had offered in the careful sideways manner of people who mean well, but don't quite know how to say so plainly to help her sell the place once she'd had time to think it over. A farm that size run by a young woman alone wasn't a realistic proposition, they suggested. Not unkindly the way you might point out a fact of weather to someone who hadn't noticed the clouds. She had thanked them and said nothing further, understanding, even then in the rawest hours of her grief, that she was not yet ready to make any decision that permanent, whatever the men at the funeral assumed was the sensible course. After the last of the mourners had gone, after the casserole dishes had been washed and stacked, and the borrowed folding chairs returned to the church basement, the house settled into a silence so complete it had a weight to it, the kind of silence that presses against the inside of your skull until you have to either fill it with something or be crushed beneath it. Nora chose to fill it. She found the journals on the second night after the funeral, when the house was too quiet to bear, and grief had nowhere left to go but into motion. She lit the kerosene lamp in his study because the wiring in that room had never worked right, not in all the years she could remember, and pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he always kept locked. The key had been on his ring of keys hanging by the back door, where it had hung her entire life, and she had never once thought to ask what it opened. There they were. A dozen leather-bound ledgers, their spines cracked, their pages soft as cloth from years of handling. She had expected numbers. Yields, debts, the arithmetic of a dying farm, the kind of dry accounting a man might keep to track exactly how much worse each season was than the one before it, a record of decline written in a steady hand, because at least the steadiness of the hand was something he could control. Instead, she found a different kind of ledger entirely. Rainfall recorded to the quarter-inch. The temperature of the irrigation ditch water taken at dawn and dusk, sometimes twice more in between if the day had been strange enough to warrant it. Sketches of root systems drawn with a careful, patient hand, the kind of hand that had time to notice things other men were too tired or too proud to see. There were small drawings in the margins too, a beetle she did not recognize, the particular curl of a leaf under drought stress, a crude diagram of how water moved through clay versus how it moved through loam. And on page after page in his small slanted handwriting, the same word kept returning like a held breath. Hungry. She sat on the floor that night long enough to piece together a timeline she hadn't known existed. The lamp burning low and her back against the cool plaster of the wall, her legs going numb beneath her, and her hands too occupied turning pages to notice. The earliest relevant entry was dated 1965, 6 years before his death, written in a hand that was steadier, then more confident, the hand of a man who still believed at least a little that the world might still surprise him in a good direction. In it, her father had written about an idea: fish ponds, water circling back on itself, rather than sitting stagnant in a single attempt to try a small version of it on a forgotten corner of the property that same season. He had dug a shallow holding pond by hand working evenings after the regular farm work was done, and had stocked it with a handful of bream from the creek that ran along the property's northern edge. He had run a narrow channel from the pond toward a half-acre of cotton no one would miss if the experiment failed. He had abandoned it within a few months. He wrote only that it felt too strange a thing to risk in front of men who already doubted whether a quiet man like him could keep the farm running at all, and that the half-acre in any case hadn't shown enough difference by midsummer to justify the ridicule he imagined would follow if anyone noticed the little pond and asked questions he wasn't ready to answer. He filled the pond back in before the next planting season. He did not try again for 3 years. Nora sat with that for a long while. She tried to imagine her father at 38, younger than she had ever known him to be, kneeling in the dirt with a shovel after a full day's work, building something he believed in, and then quietly erasing it, because the cost of being laughed at felt heavier in that moment than the cost of being wrong forever. She understood reading it that this was the part of him the county had never seen. Not the tired man who watched his yields shrink year after year. The man underneath that man, who had once had the courage to try and not quite enough courage to keep trying. Then came the 1968 entry, calmer, more certain, as though the idea had simply kept growing inside him long after he'd stopped speaking of it out loud to anyone, even to himself in the privacy of these pages. He wrote about standing at the edge of the main ditch one evening in early spring, watching a slick of green algae spread slow across the surface of standing water, and feeling, he said, like he was looking at a held breath. Water that wanted to be alive and had nowhere to put that wanting. The soil is not dead, it is only sleeping. It does not need a whip, it needs a meal. She turned the pages slowly after that, watching the handwriting change subtly over the years, steadier in some entries, shakier in others, the way handwriting changes when a man's body is failing faster than his mind. There were long gaps, sometimes months at a stretch, where nothing was written at all, and she understood without being told that those were the months the bank's letters had come, the months the worry had crowded out the watching. Near the back of the final journal, in an entry dated only months before his death, she found the drawing that would eventually change everything. A pond. Fish, small ovals with fins drawn with more confidence than the rest of the sketch, as if he had drawn that particular shape many times before in his mind, even if never again on paper. Arrows showing water flowing out across a field and circling back again. Beneath it, underlined twice the ink, pressed so hard it had nearly torn through the paper. Could the water itself be the fertilizer? There was nothing written after that entry except a single line dated 3 weeks before he died, in a hand so shaky it took her several tries to make out the words. "Tell Nora to look in the bottom drawer if I don't get the chance to show her myself." He never put it all together, she realized, sitting alone in the lamplight with the weight of that unfinished sentence settling over her like a second kind of grief. Not in any way he could act upon. He had seen the pieces of the puzzle and lacked by the end the strength to assemble them, and instead of telling her outright, instead of sitting her down and explaining what he believed and what he was too afraid to risk, he had left it for her to find locked in a drawer, trusting that if she ever looked, she would understand what he could not bring himself to say aloud. She sat with that question until the rooster crowed, and somewhere in that long lamplit silence, she made a decision that did not feel like bravery so much as inheritance. The simple, stubborn sense that some things once seen clearly enough cannot be unseen and must eventually be carried by someone. The county had its own answer to the problem of tired land, and it had nothing to do with fish. The answer was nitrogen, specifically anhydrous ammonia injected deep into the cracked earth, like a shot of adrenaline into a dying man's heart, a violent, costly cure that every farmer in the Delta had come to depend on, the way a man depends on medicine that is killing him slowly while keeping him upright in the meantime. The men at the co-op talked about it the way men talk about weather they cannot change. Debt was simply the cost of doing business now. The bank was the only filling station, and every man in that county had learned to fill up there at least once a season, signing his name beneath numbers that grew larger every year, telling themselves and each other that this was simply what modern farming required, that the old ways were a kind of nostalgia the land could no longer afford. Garland Cosgrove had refused that path, though not from the beginning and not without cost. Long before Nora was old enough to understand what the word debt truly meant, her father had taken out a loan to try the nitrogen approach himself, in a season when he was younger and more hopeful and more willing to trust what the experts told him would work. It had nearly cost him everything. He spent the better part of a decade afterward paying that loan back slowly, brutally, telling no one in the county exactly how close he had come to losing the land his own father had cleared by hand. The family doctor had once told Nora's mother in a conversation Nora was never meant to overhear, sitting on the back stairs as a girl of 11, with her knees pulled to her chest, that the strain of those years had done lasting damage to her father's heart. The kind of damage that does not show up on an x-ray, but settles in all the same quietly. The way water settles into ground it has no business reaching. He never borrowed again after that. The men of the county called it stubbornness, pride, a kind of slow surrender dressed up as principle. Nora understood now it had been something else entirely. A man who had already paid once in full for believing the chemical promise and who had spent the rest of his life determined never to pay that price a second time, even as his yields shrank around him and his neighbors grew confident on debt he no longer trusted. She thought too about the version of herself that had grown up inside that household, watching her father work himself thin on land that gave back less every season, never once asking why he didn't simply do what everyone else did. She had assumed as a girl that it was a kind of failure of nerve. She understood now it had been the opposite. It had taken more nerve to refuse the easy road than to walk it. And he had walked the harder one alone without ever once explaining himself, because explaining himself would have meant admitting how close he'd come to losing everything the first time he tried it their way. There was a particular memory that surfaced for her that week. One she hadn't thought of in years, of being perhaps 9 or 10 years old, riding beside her father in the same truck on a delivery run, and asking him with the blunt curiosity children carry before they learn to soften their questions, why their cotton never looked as good as Mr. Holliday's. He had been quiet a long moment before answering, his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. Looking good and being good aren't always the same thing, Nora, he'd finally said. Sometimes the prettiest field is just dressed up to hide how tired the ground underneath it really is. She hadn't understood what he meant at the time. She understood it completely now, driving the same roads 14 years later with a truck bed full of fish instead of cottonseed. She decided in the gray hour before sunrise that she would finish what he started. It did not feel like courage. It felt like the only thing left to do with grief that had nowhere else to go. She drove the old Ford pickup 2 hours east before she let herself think too hard about what she was doing, because thinking too hard was how good ideas died in this part of the world. The truck's engine coughed the whole way, a tired asthmatic sound that matched the tractor sitting useless back at the farm. The radio gave her nothing but static and a single gospel station fading in and out like a voice calling from underwater. The fish market sat at the edge of a fishing town that smelled of salt diesel and something older than both. The men working the holding tanks looked up when she walked in, and she watched their faces do the same thing every face in this story would do for years to come. Confusion sliding slowly into doubt, settling finally into something that wasn't quite pity, but stood close enough to wave at it. "You want bait?" one of them asked, wiping his hands on an apron that had seen better decades. "I want live tilapia," she said. "All you have, the young ones especially, the breeders." He blinked at her the way a man blinks at a sentence that doesn't parse. "Ma'am, that's a strange thing to want this many of." He called over a second man, older, with forearms like rope and a face that had clearly spent 40 years deciding which customers were worth a second look. He studied her a moment the way you study weather that doesn't match the season. "You aim to eat all them fish, or what exactly is the plan here?" he said, not quite a question. "I aim to put them in water that needs them more than I do," she said, and something in the plainness of the answer seemed to satisfy him more than any explanation would have, because he simply nodded once, the way men nod at things they've decided aren't their business, and told the younger one to start filling the tank. While they worked, she walked the length of the holding tanks, watching the fish move in their crowded, restless circles, and found herself thinking of her father's small sketch in the back of the journal. The crude pond and the careful arrows, wondering whether he had ever come anywhere near a place like this himself, whether he had once stood exactly where she now stood, doing the same arithmetic in his head about cost and risk, and the particular loneliness of believing in something nobody else could see. She suspected he had not. She suspected the 1965 attempt had been smaller, more cautious. A handful of bream pulled from the creek rather than a truckload of breeding stock purchased outright. The difference between a man testing the edge of an idea and a daughter committing to its entire center. She paid with the last of her father's life insurance money the cash meant to cover loan payments at least through harvest, and she did not let herself flinch as she watched the number on the receipt climb past what any sensible person would call wise. They filled a transport tank with water and hundreds of fish, their silver bodies flashing dimly under the tank's lid, a held breath of motion in the dark water. The drive home was slow, careful, the weight sloshing behind her like something alive and uncertain of its own future, which she supposed was an accurate way to describe everything about that day. She backed the truck up to the head gates of the main irrigation ditch just before sundown, when the light goes long and gold and forgiving across Delta land, the kind of light that makes even ruined things look like they might still be saved. One by one, she opened the gates and released the fish into the still brown water. They scattered, immediately vanishing into the murk with a kind of relief she found herself envying. That was when she heard the tractor. Birch Holliday's land bordered hers on the eastern side. 300 acres of cotton kept alive by more chemical than soil at this point, his fields a patchwork of lush green stretches and chemically scorched yellow ones like a quilt sewn by two very different hands. He cut his engine at the fence line and climbed down slow, the way big men climb down from tractors, with the particular caution of someone whose knees have started keeping score. He pulled a rag from his back pocket and wiped his forehead, though his face carried more confusion in it than actual sweat. Nora, he called over the fence, not unkindly, just baffled in the plain, honest way of a man who has lived his whole life by rules he never had reason to question. "What in God's name are you doing?" "Stocking the ditches, Mr. Holliday," she said, her voice steady, carrying easy across the still evening air. He squinted at her like that might bring the sentence into focus. "Stocking them for what, a fish fry?" "No, sir." She looked past him toward the fields that ran gray and pale all the way to the tree line. "For the cotton." He stared at her for a long moment, long enough that she could see him deciding behind his eyes which kind of sad he was going to feel about this. Then he shook his head, not in anger, but in the soft, settled way a man shakes his head. At a grave he's already grieved, climbed back onto his tractor, and drove away without another word. By the end of that week, the story had made its way around the entire county. Nora Cosgrove had lost her mind. Grief, they said, had finally caught up with her. Instead of borrowing what she needed, fixing the land the way it had always been fixed, she had started some kind of fish hobby in her irrigation ditches. The laughter started quiet, murmurs at the feed store. A chuckle passed between men waiting on tractor parts. But laughter in a small county is a living thing, and it grows the way kudzu grows, fast and unstoppable, climbing over every fence it finds. Have you ever staked everything you have on an idea no one else can see the shape of? Not just your money, your name, the way your neighbors will look at you for the rest of your life in that county. It is a lonely kind of bet to make, standing alone on an island of your own conviction, while the tide of everyone else's certainty rises around you, patient and rising, waiting to see if you'll still be standing when it's done. That is where Nora Cosgrove stood in the fall of 1971. Ditches full of fish, fields full of doubt. The trouble that followed was sharper than mockery, and it arrived from a direction she had not fully prepared for. 3 weeks after the fish went in, Birch appeared at her gate again, but this time his hat stayed on his head, and his voice carried none of the baffled gentleness from before. "I went and talked to a fellow at the county water board," he said. "Told him what you put in that ditch. He wasn't real pleased. Said introducing live fish into a shared irrigation system without a permit could count as contamination. Said if enough farmers downstream complain, the board could order the whole system flushed and fine, whoever started it." Nora felt something cold drop through her chest. "You went to the board on me." "I've got cotton riding on that same water, Nora. I had a right to ask questions." He shifted his weight, not quite meeting her eyes. "I didn't tell them to come out here. Not yet. But I'm telling you they're asking now. You could have come to me first." "I'm coming to you now," he said, and there was something almost like apology buried in the gruffness of it, though neither of them was ready to call it that yet. "Figured you'd rather hear it from me than from a man with a badge showing up unannounced." It was the first time the danger had stopped being a matter of pride and started being a matter of law. She spent the following nights awake at the kitchen table reading through whatever county water use codes she could find at the library in town, the librarian eyeing her with the same baffled curiosity as everyone else, but at least having the decency not to ask questions, learning that Birch was not wrong. There was no clear permission for what she had done, only an absence of anyone having thought to forbid it, because no one had ever been foolish enough to try it before her. She drove to the water board herself before they could drive to her. She sat across a metal desk from a tired clerk named Odell Pruitt, a man with reading glasses perched halfway down his nose and a stack of complaint forms that suggested he had heard every kind of farm grievance the county had to offer, and explained plainly what she intended. Circulation, not contamination. A closed system feeding her own fields, not threatening anyone else's. She brought her father's journals with her, opened to the pages with his rainfall records and water temperature logs, hoping the sheer discipline of the data might count for something, even if the idea behind it sounded strange. Pruitt studied the pages for longer than she expected. "Your daddy kept records like this for years." "Longer than I knew," she said. He did not say much else. He took notes, asked a handful of practical questions about the pump and the flow rate, and told her the board would schedule a formal inspection rather than acting on a single neighbor's complaint. She did not know sitting there whether the explanation would hold. She only knew that waiting for them to come to her would have looked like guilt, and she had decided somewhere in those sleepless nights that she was done looking like anything other than exactly what she was. The board did not shut her down. They issued a formal warning, scheduled an inspection for the following year, and made clear that one verified complaint of contamination downstream would end the experiment permanently with penalties attached. She drove home with the warning folded in the glove compartment, understanding now that the fish were never going to be the hardest part of this. The hardest part was going to be every person standing between her and the harvest who held some small piece of power over whether she was allowed to finish what she had started. The official mockery arrived a month later, driving a clean county vehicle and carrying a clipboard like a man carrying a badge. Dr. Vance Tillery was the regional agricultural extension agent, a man who wore his university degree the way some men wear a sidearm, visible, deliberate, a quiet warning to anyone who might think about disagreeing with him. He had heard about the water board complaint, and he considered it his professional duty to set the record straight before the situation grew, in his words, any more embarrassing for the county. He walked the main ditch alongside her, where a handful of the tilapia, already settling into their strange new home, swam lazily near the surface. "Miss Cosgrove," he began, his voice carrying the patient practice tone of a man explaining gravity to a child. "I understand you're attempting something novel here, but the science of soil replenishment is well established. This land requires a minimum of 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre to produce a commercially viable crop. Your father's own records confirm the soil here is severely depleted." "My father believed it wasn't dead," she said, watching the water rather than the man. "Just dormant. The microbes are asleep. They need food, not chemicals." "Not—" Tillery let out a short laugh, the kind that isn't really a laugh at all, just a sound men make instead of listening. "Microbes, Miss Cosgrove. We are discussing commercial agriculture, not a science fair project. The waste these fish produce is negligible, a drop in an ocean. You are wasting time you do not have. The planning window is closing. Let me help you secure financing. We can still save your season." "Thank you, Dr. Tillery." Her voice gave him nothing. "But I intend to see this through." He shook his head, a look crossing his face that she would come to recognize as the particular expression of educated men encountering a conclusion they had not authorized. He made a note on his clipboard, the scratch of his pen the loudest sound in the whole quiet afternoon, and turned to leave, pausing once more at the edge of the ditch. "I'll be candid with you, Miss Cosgrove, because I respect your father's memory enough to be," he said. "I don't think you're foolish. I think you're grieving, and grief makes people reach for things that feel like control when nothing else does. I've seen it before. I won't pretend I haven't." "My father wasn't grieving when he wrote the question I'm trying to answer, Dr. Tillery," she said. "He was alive and thinking clearly years before he got sick. I found the date, spring of 1968. He had 3 more good years left in him after that, and he spent every one of them too afraid to try it again. I'm not chasing a dead man's grief. I'm finishing a living man's thought before fear gets the chance to bury it twice." That seemed to land somewhere. He hadn't expected a flicker of genuine consideration crossing his face before the professional certainty reasserted itself, the way water closes back over a stone dropped into a still pond. He said nothing further, only nodded once, tucked his clipboard beneath his arm, and left without looking back. He would later use her name at the county farmers' meeting that winter as a cautionary tale, a story about how grief left unchecked could push even a sensible person toward foolishness dressed up as faith. The room had laughed loud and easy, certain of its own good sense. Nora was not there to hear it, but she felt it anyway, the way you feel a cold front moving in before the sky has even changed color. Spring brought a different kind of visitor, and a more dangerous one, because he did not come to mock her. He came to sympathize. Del Ashworth arrived in a car too clean for the roads he drove, on his shoes polished in a way that seemed almost an insult to the dust gathering at their edges. He was a regional sales representative for one of the largest chemical fertilizer companies operating in the South, and he had a particular gift for finding the exact soft place in a person and pressing on it gently as though doing them a favor. "Miss Cosgrove," he said, leaning against the hood of his car with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own charm. "I heard about your father. A real shame. Good man by every account." He let that sit a moment before continuing. "And I hear you're out here trying to keep this place going on your own. That takes nerve, I respect that." She said nothing, which he seemed to take as an invitation to continue. "Look," he said, lowering his voice into something almost conspiratorial, "your neighbors are spending a fortune on our product, and I understand the impulse to try something cheaper. I do. But this is a gamble you can't afford to lose. I'm prepared to offer you a full season's worth of our best nitrogen blend on credit. No payment due until after harvest. I'm willing to bet on you, Miss Cosgrove, and on our product." It was, she understood, even then, a kind of rope thrown across a river she had chosen to cross alone. A way back into the world everyone else already lived in. All it would cost her was the one thing her father had left her that actually mattered. "Mr. Ashworth," she said, looking past him toward the fields rather than at him, "my father taught me two things before he died: that the land has a memory, and that debt is a storm that always comes back to collect what it's owed." She turned to face him fully for the first time. "I won't be needing your offer." His smile thinned the easy charm, folding itself away like a salesman packing up a display he no longer needed. "Suit yourself," he said, pushing off the car. "But when that cotton comes up yellow and stunted and the bank starts asking questions, don't say nobody offered you a way out. There's a right way to farm in this part of the world, Miss Cosgrove, and there's a wrong way." He paused at the car door, one hand on the handle, and looked back at her with something that might, in a different man, have passed for genuine curiosity. "Can I ask you something off the record, not as a salesman, just as a man standing in your driveway?" She said nothing, which he took correctly as permission. Why fish of all the strange ideas a person could chase after losing her father? Why this one? She considered the question longer than he likely expected, looking past him toward the fields rather than at the question itself. "Because it was his," she finally said. "Not mine. He spent years circling it and never had the nerve to finish it. I figured somebody owed him the finishing, even if it wasn't going to be him." Something in his face shifted briefly, the practiced charm slipping just enough to reveal something almost human underneath it, and for a moment she thought he might actually say something true. Instead, he simply nodded, climbed into his car, and drove off, leaving a column of dust that took its time settling over the quiet fields. She stood alone with her decision a little longer than she would have liked to admit. That night, she went back to the journals, rereading the 1965 entry beside the one from 1968, finally understanding the full shape of her father's 6 lost years. The fear that had made him try once, fail quietly, and then spend the better part of a decade simply circling the idea on paper, rather than risk it in the dirt a second time. She thought about her own fear, sharp and present in her chest like a stone she hadn't noticed swallowing. If stillness was the problem, if the ditches were swamps instead of rivers, anaerobic and lifeless, the water already dead before it ever reached the roots, then what she needed wasn't faster water. She needed circling water, a current, a heartbeat. She drove to the supply store the next morning and spent nearly the last of what remained of the insurance money on the smallest electric pump they had, the kind built for slow aquarium systems, nothing meant for irrigation at all. She installed it herself, kneeling in the mud at the edge of the main ditch, hands shaking slightly, not from fear anymore, she realized, but from something closer to hope, which she had learned by then was a far more dangerous feeling to carry around a place like this. When she flipped the switch and watched the water begin slowly to move, a thin, patient current, pulling from one end of the ditch network toward the other, she felt something settle in her chest that had not settled since the night of her father's funeral. It was not certainty. She was not foolish enough to call it that. It was something smaller and sturdier. A beginning. Behind her, far off across the fence line, she could hear Birch Holliday's tractor running, and beyond that, the low, grinding hum of Del Ashworth's chemical trucks, making their rounds through the county. She turned back toward the water and watched it circle slow and steady, carrying something invisible toward roots that had forgotten a long time ago what it felt like to be fed instead of forced. Somewhere beneath the surface, in the dark and the cool and the quiet, hundreds of small silver bodies were already doing the only thing they had ever known how to do, utterly unaware that they had just become the first soldiers in a war no one else in that county even knew had been declared. The cotton would not show it yet. Not this season. Maybe not the next. But 300 acres of exhausted Mississippi earth had just taken its first real breath in over a decade, and somewhere underground in the long dark patience of root and soil, something old and half forgotten had begun very quietly to remember how to live. She stood at the head gate a long while after the last of the light had gone, listening to the pump's faint mechanical hum beneath the louder, older sounds of the delta settling into night. The cicadas, the distant bark of a dog on some neighboring property, the wind moving slow through cotton that had not yet earned the right to be called thriving, but had at least stopped dying quite so visibly. She thought of her father standing in this exact spot, year after silent year, watching the same water and saying nothing to anyone about what he saw in it. She thought of the 3 weeks since the funeral, the journals, the drive to the coast, the fish scattering into the murk like a held breath finally released. Whatever came next, however the county chose to remember this particular autumn, she understood walking back toward the dark farmhouse that she had already done the one thing her father never managed. She had said the idea out loud in front of everyone, and let it stand or fall in full view, rather than burying it quietly the way fear had once convinced him to. The Water Remembers Part 2. The first full season did not announce itself with miracles. It announced itself with silence, the particular silence of a county watching, waiting for a woman to fail in a way they could finally point to and say, there, that settles it. Nora woke before dawn now, every dawn, because the work demanded it, and because sleep had become a thin, unreliable thing since her father's death, something that came in fragments rather than whole nights. She walked the ditches before the heat rose, checking the pump, checking the fish, checking the color of the water, the way her father had once checked the color of the soil, looking for the small, slow signs of a thing either dying or coming alive, and not always certain in those early months which one she was watching. The cotton plants themselves gave her no comfort. They came up thin and pale that first spring, indistinguishable from any other struggling field in the county. And for a while she let herself wonder if Dr. Tillery had been right after all, if she had mistaken a dying man's hopeful scribbles for some kind of revelation, when really they had only been the last grasping thoughts of a man too tired to think clearly anymore. She did not let herself wonder this for long. There was too much work for despair to take up permanent residence. She learned to fix the old Massey Ferguson herself that spring, her hands once slender and soft turning calloused and capable in a matter of weeks. The first time she got the engine to turn over after 3 days of stripped bolts and skinned knuckles, she sat in the driver's seat a long moment, letting the tractor idle beneath her, and felt something close to pride for the first time since the funeral. It was a small thing. It felt enormous anyway. She canned vegetables from the small garden behind the house. She patched her own dresses rather than buy new ones. She counted every dollar twice before she let it leave her hand, because the insurance money was gone, now spent on fish and pipe and a small electric pump that the rest of the county still considered the punchline of a joke that had stopped being funny to everyone except the people telling it. She taught herself that first year to read the land the way her father had, though it did not come naturally at first, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it. She would stand at the edge of a field some mornings trying to see what he must have seen, the particular slope of a furrow, the way certain patches of cotton came up paler than others, even within the same row, and feel mostly confusion where she suspected he had once felt clarity. She kept at it anyway, the way you keep practicing a language you were not raised, speaking, trusting that fluency was simply a matter of time and repetition, rather than some gift she either had or didn't. A neighbor woman named Pearl Atchison, an elderly widow who lived 2 farms down and had known Nora's mother before she died, began stopping by some Sunday afternoons, that first year ostensibly to bring over preserves or check on the chickens, though Nora suspected and never said aloud that the real purpose of the visits was simply to make sure she wasn't drowning in the particular kind of solitude grief tends to manufacture for people determined to carry it alone. Pearl never once asked about the fish. She talked about the weather, about her late husband, about nothing in particular, and left an hour later having said almost nothing of consequence and having somehow made the week ahead feel less impossible to face. Nora came to treasure those visits more than she ever told her, the way you treasure something only after realizing how much its absence would have cost you. Pearl had buried a husband of her own 30 years earlier, a man who had died young in a tractor accident, leaving her to run their small operation alone. Through a decade, the county still spoke of, when it spoke of it at all, as among the hardest the Delta had seen. She rarely mentioned it directly, but Nora came to understand through small, offhand comments dropped across a dozen Sunday afternoons that Pearl recognized something of her own younger self in Nora's situation, a woman suddenly alone with land and grief, and no clear template for how either was supposed to be carried. It was Pearl, not Tillery or Ashworth or even Birch, who first told Nora plainly that the county's opinion of her would shift eventually one way or another, and that the only mistake worth fearing was changing course simply to hurry that shift along before she was certain of her own conviction. "Folks forget faster than you'd think," Pearl told her one Sunday, sitting on the porch with a jar of preserves between them. "They'll laugh at you for exactly as long as it's convenient, and then one day it won't be convenient anymore, and they'll act like they never laughed at all. Don't waste your strength worrying about which day that'll be. Just make sure you're still standing on it when it comes." There were nights that first winter when the loneliness arrived with a weight she hadn't expected, sitting alone at a kitchen table built for three, listening to wind move through fields that no longer had anyone in them but her. She had not understood as a girl how much of her father's quiet had been this exact thing, the particular silence of a person who has chosen a harder road than the people around him and has no one left to talk to about why. The water board inspector returned that autumn exactly as promised, walking the ditch line with a clipboard of his own, dipping a testing kit into the water at 3 points downstream, and writing his findings without much expression on his face. He found nothing he could call contamination. He left with a curt nod and no further comment, which Nora had learned by then to count as the closest thing to victory the world was likely to offer her that year. Birch Holliday watched the inspector's truck leave from his own porch that afternoon, and though neither of them spoke of it directly for some time, something in the way he nodded to her at the feed store the following week carried a little less certainty in it than before, as if the absence of a violation had cost him some small private wager he'd made with himself. It was in the second year that the doubt found her properly, and it did not arrive the way she expected. It did not arrive as exhaustion, though she was exhausted. It did not arrive as loneliness, though she was profoundly bone deep, lonely in a way she had never quite admitted to herself, not even in the privacy of her own thoughts. It arrived instead on an afternoon in July in the form of Birch Holliday's irrigation pumps. She heard them from her porch, the low mechanical drone running steady through the heat day and night now, because a heat wave had settled over the Delta that summer like a hand pressing down on everything living. She could see the shimmer rising off his cotton from half a mile away, the deep, aggressive green of chemically forced growth, lush and immediate in a way her own fields simply were not. Her own cotton, by comparison, looked fragile. The leaves curled faintly at the edges in the worst of the afternoon heat, and though she told herself this was the plant resting rather than suffering some nights, she was not entirely sure she believed it. The farm journal that came free in the mail did not help. Its pages were full of glossy advertisements for chemical blends that promised lush green growth and guaranteed yields. Photographs of cotton so perfect it looked almost unreal, like something drawn rather than grown. She found herself staring at those pages some evenings longer than she meant to, doing the same arithmetic over and over in her head. How much a loan would cost her? How fast she could turn this season into something that looked finally like everyone else's. She drove into town one Saturday that summer for supplies and found herself standing outside the bank for nearly 10 full minutes, watching men she had known her whole life walk in and out through the glass doors with the easy confidence of people who had already decided what kind of farmers they were going to be and never had to think about it again. She imagined standing there what it would feel like to walk in herself, to sign her name, to drive home that same afternoon with a truck bed full of nitrogen and the particular relief of no longer being the strangest person in the county. She did not go in, but she carried the wanting home with her anyway, the way you carry a stone in your shoe that you keep meaning to shake loose and somehow never do. One evening, the wanting got loud enough that she actually pulled her father's truck keys off the hook by the door. She stood there a long moment, keys in hand, telling herself she was simply going into town for supplies. But she knew, even as she told herself that, exactly which building in town she was thinking about walking into and exactly what kind of papers she imagined signing once she got there. She did not leave that night. Instead, she walked back into her father's study and opened the journal to the page with the drawing, the crude little pond, the arrows, the fish, the single underlying question that had started all of this in the first place. Could the water itself be the fertilizer? She read it 3 times. She ran her fingers slowly over the worn paper over handwriting she would have recognized blind in the dark after he'd been gone 50 years. And she thought not for the first time about the version of her father who had tried this exact idea 6 years earlier and quietly buried it instead of fighting for it. The version of him who had let fear win and who had spent the rest of his life paying for that surrender, one shrinking harvest at a time. She thought too about something her mother used to say back when her mother was still alive, to say anything at all about how a Cosgrove's stubbornness ran 2 directions at once, toward the thing they believed in and away from anyone who told them to stop believing it. She had always assumed that was a flaw. Sitting there with the journal open in her lap, she began to wonder if it might be the only inheritance worth keeping. She was not going to become the version of her father who buried the idea. Whatever else happened, whatever the county said, whatever it cost her in the eyes of men like Tillery and Ashworth, who had already decided with great confidence exactly how this story was supposed to end. She set the truck keys back on the hook by the door and did not touch them again that summer. Between the second year and the drought that would eventually arrive in the spring, after there was a stretch of months Nora would later remember less as a single season and more as a long, quiet apprenticeship, the kind no school in the county would have recognized as an education at all. She spent that autumn rebuilding the headgates by hand, replacing the rusted iron her father had never had the money to repair, learning to weld badly, and then less badly under the patient, half-amused instruction of an old machinist in town named Otis Pruitt, who asked no questions about why a young woman wanted to learn to weld irrigation gates and simply showed her twice, then let her ruin 3 pieces of scrap metal before she got it right on the 4th. He never once mentioned the fish. She suspected he already knew and had simply decided, the way a handful of people in the county quietly had, that her business was her own to ruin or redeem. Otis had known her father for nearly 30 years, the two of them having traded work back and forth across that span the way men in small counties do. And one afternoon, watching her finally weld a clean seam on the 4th piece of scrap, he set down his own torch and studied her a long moment with an expression she couldn't quite place. "Your daddy used to come in here some evenings," he said, "just to sit. Didn't always need something fixed. Just needed somewhere to sit that wasn't his own kitchen, I expect, after your mama passed. He'd talk sometimes about the land, about things he was thinking on trying. Never did try most of them, far as I could tell." "Did he ever mention fish?" she asked, careful to keep her voice even. Otis considered this, scratching at the gray stubble along his jaw. "Once, years back. Talked about it the way a man talks about a dream he already knows he's not going to chase. I didn't think much of it at the time. Strange you ending up here doing the very thing he talked himself out of." He picked his torch back up, the conversation apparently finished. As far as he was concerned, though, something in the set of his shoulders suggested he'd filed the moment away, somewhere he intended to keep it. She began keeping her own journal that winter separate from her father's, not because she had decided yet that the system was succeeding, but because she had inherited enough of his instinct to know that even failure was worth recording honestly, in case some other stubborn soul years from now needed the data more than they needed the legend. She wrote down everything: the days the pump jammed with silt, the morning 24 fish turned belly up after a cold snap she hadn't anticipated, and the grief that surprised her at finding them small and silver and still floating at the surface like something she had failed to protect. She wrote down the exact temperature that had killed them so it would never happen again, and it never did. She read every agricultural bulletin she could get her hands on that did not come through Dr. Tillery's office, ordering pamphlets from university extension programs in other states in Alabama and Louisiana, and even one eventually from a small experimental station in California that had begun publishing early findings on something called aquaponics, a word she had never heard before, and which made her sit very still at the kitchen table the first time she read it, because it meant suddenly that she was not as alone in this as the county had convinced her she was. Somewhere, men with university letterheads were beginning slowly, cautiously to ask the same question her father had scrawled in the margin of a journal 6 years before any of them put their names to a paper about it. She wrote to the address listed at the bottom of that California pamphlet, a short, careful letter describing what she had built and what she had observed, not expecting a reply. 6 weeks later, one came anyway from a junior researcher named Holt Abernathy, polite and curious, and entirely without the condescension she had come to expect from every other man with a degree who had crossed her path. He asked detailed questions about her stocking density, her circulation rate, the construction of her headgates. She answered every one of them in full, and the two of them kept up a slow, irregular correspondence over the following years. Two strangers in two different states quietly comparing notes on an idea. The rest of the agricultural establishment had not yet decided was worth taking seriously. It was in its own modest way the first time since her father's death that she felt entirely understood by another living person, even one she had never met and likely never would. In his third letter, Abernathy admitted something that surprised her with its candor. His own research station had nearly shut down his project the previous year. A dean somewhere up the chain of command, deciding the work sounded too much like backyard tinkering, to merit continued funding, and he had kept it alive only by working unpaid hours on weekends. The way she suspected most genuinely useful ideas got built by people stubborn enough to keep going after the people with the budgets had already decided to stop believing. She found a strange comfort in that the knowledge that the loneliness she carried in a Mississippi cotton field had its mirror 3,000 miles away, in a university laboratory, two people separately discovering that the establishment rarely moves as fast as the truth does. The drought arrived the following spring, the worst the county had seen in living memory, and it did not land equally, and that was the thing nobody in the county had been prepared to learn. Birch Holliday's fields, soaked for years in chemical fertilizer and heavy irrigation, had grown a kind of soil that no longer held water the way soil was meant to. The salts had built up season after season, the way debt builds in a ledger, until the ground itself had turned brittle and indifferent, unable to hold a single drop longer than it took to evaporate. He came to the fence line one burning afternoon in June, not to mock her this time, but because his own desperation had outgrown his pride. "My cotton's dying out there," he said, his voice rough in a way she had not heard from him before. Not the baffled tone of a man confused by a neighbor's foolishness, but the flat, frightened tone of a man watching his livelihood disappear in real time. "Water just runs right off the top of the ground anymore, like the dirt's gone slick as a tin roof." She did not gloat. She found standing there that she did not have it in her to gloat at a man watching his life's work fail. However many times he had called her foolish over the years, however many times he had carried his worry straight to the water board's door instead of her own. "It's the salt," she said quietly. "Years of nitrogen built up in there with nowhere to go. The ground can't breathe anymore, can't hold what it needs. Is there anything to be done for it?" "Time," she said, "and feeding it something other than what's already poisoned it. I don't know that there's a fast way back from where your fields are now, Mr. Holliday. I'm sorry to say it plain, but you asked." He looked at her a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Not quite an apology, not yet, but the first crack in a wall that had stood between them since the day she'd released the first fish into the ditch. He nodded once, turned, and walked back toward his own dying fields without another word, though something in the set of his shoulders looked different than it had on his way over. What he did not tell her that day, what she would only learn much later, was that the desperation eating at him had already pushed some of the younger men in the county towards something uglier than mockery or complaints filed at the water board. 2 nights after that conversation, she woke to find the small electric pump at the main headgate disconnected, the wire pulled loose, and left dangling deliberately in a way that wind and weather could not explain on their own. She stood at the head gate in the dark, lantern in one hand, the loose wire in the other, and felt something in her chest go very cold and very still. She thought of calling the sheriff. She thought of driving straight to Birch Holliday's door and asking him plainly whether he knew who had done this. In the end, she did neither. She simply reconnected the wire by lantern light, her hands steady despite the cold fury sitting low in her stomach, and she began checking the connection twice a day, after that at dawn, and at dusk, the way her father had once checked the temperature of the ditchwater patient, watchful, refusing to be surprised twice by the same kind of cruelty. She never learned for certain who had done it. She had her suspicions, 2 younger men from a family down the county road who had laughed loudest at the co-op the previous winter. But she kept those suspicions to herself, understanding that an accusation she couldn't prove would only give the county one more reason to call her unstable rather than wronged. She mentioned it only once to Dr. Tillery, who happened to pass her on the road into town not long after. He slowed his county vehicle, rolled down the window, and asked with what she took at the time for genuine concern whether anything was the matter. She told him briefly about the wire. He was quiet a moment and then said something that surprised her with its honesty, even if it offered no comfort. "I won't pretend I'm sorry to see this thing struggle, Miss Cosgrove," he said. "I think you're wrong about the science, and I'll go on thinking it until you prove me otherwise. But sabotage is a different matter entirely. If you have a name, take it to the sheriff. Whatever else we disagree about, I won't stand for that kind of cowardice in this county." It was in its strange way the most respect he had shown her, yet an acknowledgement that disagreement and decency were not the same thing, even from a man who clearly still believed she was wasting her life on a fool's errand. She thanked him, and they did not speak again for nearly 2 years after that. It was that same punishing summer that the truth about her father's debt finally surfaced in full, and it arrived in the cruelest possible way through a letter forwarded from the bank addressed to a dead man. She almost did not open it, but something in the return address made her hand stop and reconsider. And when she slid the letter free and read it through twice in the dim kitchen light, she understood for the first time exactly what her father's stubborn refusal of chemical credit had actually been protecting her from. The letter detailed an old loan taken out years before she was born, during a season when a younger, more hopeful Garland Cosgrove had briefly tried the nitrogen path everyone else swore by. The numbers on that loan, compounding quietly for over a decade, had very nearly cost him the farm entirely. In the early 60s, a debt so consuming that the doctor who treated him afterward, for what the family had always simply called his bad years, had privately told her mother that the stress alone was doing more damage to her father's heart than any single season's worth of failed crops ever could. He had nearly lost everything once already. He had paid that loan off slowly, brutally over years of going without, and he had never told a single soul in the county how close he'd come to losing the land his own father had cleared by hand. That was the wound underneath the wisdom she understood now, sitting alone at the kitchen table with the letter trembling slightly in her hand. That was why he had refused every season after to ever sign his name to another loan, even as his yields shrank and his neighbors grew rich on debt he no longer trusted. He had not been weak. He had been a man who had already paid once the full price of believing the chemical promise, and who had spent the rest of his life quietly determined never to pay it again, even if the silence cost him everything else. She thought about all the years she had watched him work himself thin, without once asking why he refused the easier road, and felt a fresh grief settle over the old one. The particular grief of understanding someone fully, only after they are gone, when there is no longer any way to tell them. You finally see what it cost them to protect you from a mistake they'd already survived once. She folded the letter and placed it inside the same journal that held his question about the water. And she sat there a long while in the dark, understanding finally completely what she was actually fighting for. It was not pride anymore. It had stopped being pride a long time ago, if it had ever truly been that to begin with. It was a promise she hadn't known she was making until this exact moment. A promise that the fear which had nearly broken her father once, and which had quietly shaped every choice he made afterward, was going to end with her. Whatever it cost. Whatever the county believed about her in the meantime. She wrote to Holt Abernathy that week, the California researcher, telling him for the first time the full story behind the system, her father's failed attempt in 1965, the debt he had nearly drowned in the silence he had carried for the rest of his life, rather than risk the idea a second time. She had not meant to tell him so much. The letter ran 6 pages longer than any she had sent him before, and when his reply came a month later, it contained a single line she kept folded in her coat pocket for the rest of that year, reading it some mornings before she even reached the ditches. "Grief is just love that ran out of places to go. It sounds like yours finally found one." The third year brought the first honest signs that something beneath the surface had genuinely changed, and they arrived in small, almost embarrassingly humble ways, nothing the men at the co-op would have called proof of anything. She found earthworms in the soil that spring, the first she had seen on the property since she was a girl small enough to be carried on her father's shoulders through these same fields. She knelt in the furrow a long while that morning, watching the worm move slow through the dark crumble of dirt, and felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in years, a knot she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. The water in the ditches had shifted color too, the murky brown of the early days, giving way to something clearer, faintly green alive in a way that was visible even to an untrained eye, if that eye knew where to look. The smell had changed as well. Where the ditches had once carried the flat, stagnant odor of standing water going slowly bad, there was now something cleaner underneath it, an earthy mineral scent, The smell, she thought of a healthy pond rather than a dying swamp. She crumbled soil between her fingers at the edge of the main furrow one evening and felt for the first time in 3 years something that was unmistakably different from the pale ash-like dust her father had described in his journals. It held together now. It had weight and texture that meant something, the faint, unmistakable structure of ground that had remembered slowly, painfully, what it used to feel like to be alive. She wrote to Holt Abernathy about it that same week, describing the texture in more detail than she suspected any scientist actually needed, and his reply when it came contained a phrase she copied into her own journal beneath her father's underlined question because it seemed somehow to belong there. Soil structure like that doesn't lie, he had written. Whatever the official channels decide to believe, the dirt itself has already cast its vote. She sent a second soil sample that fall, this time, to a laboratory 3 counties over, deliberately outside the regional extension network that ran through Dr. Tillery's office, after a chance remark from a clerk at the courthouse made it clear that her first sample the previous year had simply sat unprocessed for months longer than it should have, delayed without explanation by an office that had quietly decided her question wasn't worth answering quickly. When the new results arrived in her post office box that winter, her hands trembled as she opened the envelope the same way they had trembled the first time. Except this time the trembling carried something closer to hope than dread. Organic matter content, which had measured a dangerously low 0.5% when she first inherited the land, had climbed past 1.5%. The report noted, almost as an aside, an unusually high level of microbial activity in the sample, the precise scientific language for something her father had simply called the land waking up. She read that line 4 times before she allowed herself to believe it was real. She drove out to the cemetery that same afternoon, the report folded in her coat pocket, and stood a long while at her father's headstone without saying anything out loud, because there was nothing to say that the silence didn't already understand. The yield that year still sat just below the county average, modest, unremarkable by any standard the men at the co-op would have respected. But for the first time in over a decade, the Cosgrove farm finished a season in the black, her expenses a small fraction of what every other farm around her had spent, to achieve a result no better and in many cases worse than her own. She did not announce this to anyone. She simply kept walking the ditches each morning, checking the pump, watching the water circle slow and patient beneath a delta sky that had very quietly stopped being her enemy and started becoming, for the first time since her father's death, something closer to a partner she was finally beginning to understand. Pearl Atchison came by that winter with a jar of fig preserves, as she often did, and stood with Nora a while at the edge of the main ditch, the two of them watching the water move in its slow, patient circle without either feeling much need to fill the silence with conversation. Pearl finally spoke, almost to herself, looking out at the dark water rather than at Nora. "Your daddy used to stand right here," she said. "Same spot, same look on his face you've got right now. I used to wonder what he saw out there that the rest of us didn't." "I wonder the same thing some mornings," Nora admitted. Pearl smiled, the kind of smile that carries more history in it than words could manage. "I think he just saw it before it was ready to be seen. That's a lonely thing to be able to do, Nora. I expect you know that better than most by now." Somewhere across the fence line, Birch Holliday's fields continued their slow, salted decline. Somewhere beyond that, the county still spoke her name in the same breath as grief and foolishness, even as the numbers quietly had already begun proving otherwise. And somewhere beneath the surface of the irrigation ditches, she had stalked against every piece of advice the county had to offer water that had learned finally how to move in a circle, instead of standing still, was carrying an idea her father had been too afraid to finish, toward a kind of vindication. None of them yet understood was already underway. The Water Remembers Part 3. The 5th year arrived with a drought that broke records dating back to before anyone in the county had been born, and it was that drought more than any harvest before it that finally made the truth impossible for anyone to keep looking away from. The heat came in May and refused to leave through October, settling over the delta like something with intent rather than weather. The rivers ran low. The county wells dropped to levels the older farmers had only heard about in stories from their own fathers. Stories about the bad years, the kind of years that ended families in empty towns. Cotton withered across thousands of acres that summer, the green going first dull, then yellow, then the particular gray-brown of plants that have simply stopped trying. Birch Holliday's fields, already weakened by years of salt-burdened soil, collapsed almost entirely. She watched it happen from her own porch in slow motion across the fence line, the deep aggressive green that had once made her own cotton look fragile by comparison, now curling and dying under a sun that no longer cared which farmer had played by which rules. His irrigation pumps ran constantly, desperately pulling more water than the wells could safely give, and still the ground refused to hold any of it. The salts in the soil rejecting moisture, the way a wound rejects a bandage applied too late. Her own fields told a different story. The soil beneath her cotton had spent 4 years quietly rebuilding itself into something that behaved less like dirt and more like a living sponge, dense with organic matter threaded through with root systems and microbial life that held water the way her father's journals had once described, patient and deep, a reservoir built underground rather than chased frantically across the surface. When she irrigated, the water did not simply run off and evaporate within the hour the way it did on Birch's land. It sank in. It stayed. It fed the roots slowly the way a good meal feeds a body, rather than disappearing the way a quick fix disappears the moment it's needed most. Her cotton bent under the heat that summer. It did not break. She walked the rows some evenings that summer, simply to watch them hold, the way you might watch a person you love recover from an illness. You weren't certain they'd survive, with a kind of disbelieving gratitude that didn't fully settle into confidence, even as the evidence accumulated day after day. The leaves stayed dark green long after every other field in the county had gone the color of old newspaper. The bowls came in heavy and full, indifferent to a sky that had stopped delivering rain in any meaningful amount since the first week of June. She thought, walking those rows, about the years she had spent doubting whether any of it would ever amount to more than a stubborn woman's expensive grief. She thought about the wire someone had pulled loose at the headgate, about Dr. Tillery's clipboard, about Dell Ashworth's golden offer of credit she had refused at the cost of looking foolish to an entire county. None of it had broken her in the end, any more than the drought was managing to break her cotton. She understood, walking those rows in the relentless heat, that this was likely the closest thing to proof her father's question would ever receive, not a laboratory result or a university paper, but simply a field standing green while every field around it turned to dust. She wrote to Holt Abernathy that August, describing the drought and her field's strange resilience in the middle of it, and his reply arrived faster than usual, carrying an excitement that bled through even his typically measured scientific prose. He asked permission to cite her data anonymously at first, in a paper his small research station was preparing on water retention in biologically active soils. She gave it gladly, understanding even then that somewhere far from Mississippi, in a place that had never heard the laughter at the co-op, her father's question was finally being taken seriously by people whose opinion the county might someday be forced to respect, whether they wanted to or not. The harvest that fall was the kind of result that does not require interpretation. The numbers were posted as they always were, on the board outside the cotton gin, where every farmer in the county eventually came to see how his season measured against his neighbors. Nora Cosgrove, 2.2 bales per acre. The county average, dragged down by a season of widespread failure, sat at 1.8, and that average included farms that had spent fortunes on chemical inputs her own farm had never once purchased. She had grown more cotton with less water, no pesticides, and not a single dollar of debt, in the single worst drought the county had seen in living memory. The silence that followed at the co-op was not the silence of people choosing to ignore her anymore. It was the particular silence of people trying to rearrange everything they believed about how the world worked, and finding the work slower and more humiliating than they had expected it to be. A young reporter from the Regional Farm Bureau newsletter drove out that winter, having heard about the numbers from a clerk at the gin who couldn't keep quiet about them, and asked Nora for an interview. She agreed reluctantly, more because she suspected her father would have wanted the record set straight than from any desire for the attention itself. The article ran 2 months later under a modest headline, the kind of careful hedging language editors use when they are not yet certain whether a story will hold up to scrutiny. It did not change the county overnight, but it meant that for the first time the word fish and the word success appeared in the same sentence in print, in a publication men at the co-op actually read. And that alone shifted something in the air that no amount of posted yield numbers had quite managed to shift on its own. Birch Holliday came to her fence line again that winter, hat in his hands, his own land scorched and salted beyond any quick recovery. He did not say much. He had never been a man of many words, even before pride had made him quieter still. "You were right," he said finally, his voice rough with something that was not quite shame and not quite gratitude, but stood somewhere uncomfortably between the two. "All this time, I don't know how you knew, but you were right. I didn't know, she said. Not at first. I just didn't have a better idea, and I trusted somebody who'd run out of time to prove his. He nodded slowly as if that answer cost him something to accept, and looked out past her toward the dark, healthy line of her fields. Wish I'd asked more questions 7 years back instead of going straight to the waterboard. Might have saved us both some grief. Might have, she said, and let it sit there without pressing further because there was no real satisfaction left in this story that required anyone's further humbling. Only a quiet, settled understanding that the work itself had finally spoken in a language even the most stubborn men in the county could no longer argue with. It was 2 years after that harvest, 7 years after the first fish had vanished into the murky water of the irrigation ditch, that Del Ashworth's car appeared on her road again. He had aged in ways that surprised her. The polish was gone from his shoes. Deep lines had carved themselves around his eyes, the particular wear of a man who had spent recent years watching numbers move in directions he could no longer control. The cost of natural gas, the essential raw ingredient in the nitrogen fertilizer his company sold, had climbed steadily for years, squeezing margins that had once seemed permanent. Farmers across the Delta, buried in debt from decades of chemical dependence, were beginning to ask the kind of questions his sales pitches had never been built to answer. He had heard about her yields for years, the way rumors travel slow and steady through farm country, gathering weight with every retelling. He had dismissed them at first as exaggeration, then as a fluke, a single lucky season that statistics would eventually correct. But the numbers had not corrected themselves. They had only grown more consistent, more undeniable season after season, until even a man whose entire career depended on not believing her could no longer afford the comfort of disbelief. He found her in the old barn, not in the field, bent over the ancient cotton picker with grease on her hands and a focus in her eyes that had nothing soft left in it. She looked up when he entered, and he saw immediately that the young woman he had tried to charm and bully 7 years earlier no longer existed in any meaningful sense. What stood before him now was a woman shaped entirely by solitude, patience, and the particular kind of certainty that only comes from being right when everyone around you was certain you were wrong. "Miss Cosgrove," he began, and something in his voice carried none of the old salesman's polish. "I owe you an apology." She said nothing. She let the silence stretch the way she had learned to let silence stretch over the years, understanding that most men, given enough quiet, eventually said the truer thing underneath whatever they'd planned to say first. "I was wrong," he admitted finally, the words clearly costing him something. "I came out here 7 years ago and treated you like a fool. Everyone did. But what you've built here, the yields no chemical inputs at all. I don't understand how it's possible. How did you know?" She wiped her hands slowly on an old rag and looked past him out the wide barn door toward fields that had gone from pale ash gray to a deep living brown over the course of nearly a decade. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "Not at first. My father had a feeling, and he ran out of time before he could prove it. Men like you and Dr. Tillery looked at this land and saw a chemistry problem, something to be forced into giving you what you wanted on a schedule that suited you. My father taught me to see it as something alive instead, something that needed to be fed, not whipped." Ashworth absorbed this for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Not quite humility, but the closest thing his particular profession allowed him to feel. "My company would pay a great deal of money for this," he said eventually, his old instincts surfacing despite everything. "We could license the system, develop a product line around it. The starter fish, the circulation pumps, the whole package sold as a kit. You could be a very wealthy woman, Miss Cosgrove. We could take this method nationwide." She let the offer sit in the quiet barn air a moment before answering. "Mr. Ashworth," she said, and something almost gentle entered her voice, though the certainty underneath it never wavered. "You still don't understand. The moment you package this to sell it, you'll break the only part of it that actually works. You're still trying to put something alive into a bag and price it by the pound. This doesn't belong to me. It belongs to this land. The knowledge belongs to anyone willing to listen to their own piece of ground long enough to hear what it needs. It was never for sale, and it never will be." He stood there a long moment, visibly searching for a counter-argument his training had simply never prepared him to make. He had come looking for a product, something he could quantify, package, and exploit the way his entire career had taught him to exploit every opportunity that walked through his door. He had found instead a philosophy he could neither touch nor own, and the realization left him with nothing left to offer her. "For what it's worth," he said, finally turning toward the barn door, "I think my father would have liked you. He started that company on the same kind of stubborn belief you've got. Lost his way somewhere chasing the next quarter instead. I don't suppose you'd consider consulting even informally. Not for the company. For me. I'd like to understand it properly before I retire if nothing else." It was an honest enough request that she did not refuse it outright. "I'll answer your questions, Mr. Ashworth, same as I would anybody's. I just won't sign anything." He nodded, something almost like relief crossing his face, as if the refusal of money had somehow made the offer of friendship easier to extend. He visited twice more over the following years, always without his company car, always asking questions rather than making offers. And though they never became close in any way, the county would have recognized as such, the hostility between them quietly resolved itself into something neither of them had expected at the start, a kind of mutual hard-won respect. The last time he came, he brought his daughter, a serious girl of perhaps 12, who had grown up hearing her father's company name spoken with a certain reverence, and was clearly puzzled to learn, walking the ditches beside Nora that afternoon, that the woman everyone in this part of the world spoke of with such respect had built her entire reputation on refusing the very product her father's company sold. She asked sharp, curious questions, the kind only children who haven't yet learned to be embarrassed by their own curiosity tend to ask, and Nora answered each one patiently, recognizing something of her younger self in the girl's stubborn insistence on understanding rather than simply accepting. "Do you think it'll still work 100 years from now?" the girl asked, crouching at the edge of the ditch to watch the water circle. "I think it'll work as long as somebody's willing to watch it closely enough to notice when it needs adjusting," Nora told her. "That's the part people always want to skip. They want the system to run itself forever once it's built. Nothing alive works that way. Not land, not water, not people." The girl considered this with the particular gravity children reserve for ideas they suspect are more important than the adults around them realize. And Ashworth, watching from a few steps back, looked at his daughter with an expression Nora hadn't seen on him before, something that looked almost like hope for a future shaped differently than his own had been. Dr. Vance Tillery did not disappear from the county the way Ashworth eventually did. He stayed on another decade in his post, watching from a careful distance as farm after farm around the Cosgrove place buckled under the very debts he had once recommended. Without hesitation, the salt building in their soil, exactly the way Nora had always quietly predicted it would. It was nearly 15 years after he had first stood at her ditch with his clipboard that he finally crossed paths with her again, this time at a regional agricultural symposium, invited against his own private objections to hear her speak about soil regeneration to a room full of younger extension agents who had grown up hearing her name spoken with something closer to reverence than ridicule. He sat near the back, recognizing her immediately, and stayed through the entire talk rather than slipping out early the way pride might once have urged him to. She spoke plainly that afternoon, the way she had always spoken, describing not a miracle, but a method, circulation, and patience, and the slow chemistry of microbial life, careful to credit a man named Garland Cosgrove for the question that had started it all, a man none of the young agents in that room had ever heard of, and who would, she made clear, have been embarrassed by any fuss made over him at all. One of the younger agents in the audience, a woman not much older than Nora had been when she first stocked the ditches, raised her hand during the question period and asked with the particular bluntness of someone early enough in a career to still believe bluntness was rewarded, why it had taken the agricultural establishment nearly 2 decades to take the method seriously when the data had apparently been sitting in plain sight the entire time. Nora considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't think it was malice mostly," she said. "I think it's just hard for people who've built their whole careers on one way of doing things to look at evidence that suggests a different way might work better. That's not a flaw particular to scientists or extension agents. It's a flaw particular to being human. The land doesn't care how long it takes us to notice what it's telling us. It just keeps telling us season after season until somebody's finally ready to listen." She did not look at Tillery when she said it, though she was aware of him sitting near the back of the room, and she suspected from the stillness that came over him that he understood the answer was meant for him as much as for the young woman who'd asked the question. Afterward, Tillery approached her in the hallway, his clipboard long retired, his hands empty for once. "I owe you an apology too, Miss Cosgrove," he said, his voice lacking the old certainty entirely. "I had the degree. I had the studies. I never once considered that the studies might be incomplete. I called what you were doing a fool's errand in front of a room full of farmers who trusted me to know better. I've thought about that more than I'd like to admit over the years. They weren't wrong, Dr. Tillery, she said not unkindly. They just weren't the whole picture. My father used to say the land has a memory. Maybe the science does too. It just takes longer to remember than people are usually willing to wait. I retire next spring, he said. I've recommended your operation as a case study for the next generation of agents coming through the program. I imagine that's a small thing set against everything else, but it's the truest correction I know how to make at this point in my career. She thanked him and found to her own quiet surprise that she meant it. He nodded, something easing in his face that had been tight there for a very long time, and that was the last conversation the two of them ever had. He died 6 years later, and she sent a card to his widow, who wrote back a short, gracious note saying he had spoken of Nora often in his final years, always by then, with admiration rather than the old condescension. The years that followed moved the way real change tends to move, not in single dramatic moments, but in a long, patient accumulation that only becomes visible when you finally stop and look backward. When interest rates climbed sharply through the early 80s, farm debts across the Delta became anchors, dragging entire families under the chemical dependence that had once promised prosperity, revealing itself finally as exactly the kind of storm her father had warned her about decades earlier. Nora, carrying no debt of her own, began to expand. Birch Holliday was the first to sell. He came to her with his hat in his hands once more, his own land poisoned beyond recovery by years of the very chemicals he had once defended. Without question, his spirit worn thin by a bank that had stopped extending him the patience it once had. She paid him a fair price, more than fair, because there was no satisfaction left in this story that required anyone's further suffering. As he left the farmhouse he had lived in his entire adult life, for the last time he stopped at the edge of the porch and looked back at her, his voice thick with something he had clearly been holding in for a long while. "You were right, Nora," he said again, softer this time. "All this time. You were right." She took his exhausted land, and with the same patience that had carried her through the first impossible years, began the slow work of bringing it back to life. Over the following decades, she did the same with 4 more neighboring farms, acquiring each one, not with the predatory instincts of men like Ashworth, but as something closer to a rescuer arriving precisely when the chemical model finally collapsed under its own weight. Her farm grew from 300 acres to nearly 2,000, an island of dark, breathing soil surrounded by land that decades of force had finally permanently exhausted. She became known throughout the region simply as the Fish Woman, a title that had once been spoken with mockery and was now spoken almost universally with something closer to reverence. The other 3 farms came to her in roughly the order their owners' debts finally caught up with them. Each sale its own small, quiet ceremony of the same grief Birch had carried to her porch. There was a widow named Lucille Faraday, whose husband had died of a heart attack at 51 after 3 consecutive years of failed harvests on chemically exhausted ground, who sold to Nora with tears she did not try to hide, saying only that she was grateful her land would finally go to someone who might actually heal it, rather than simply pass the same poisoned dirt along to the next desperate buyer. Lucille stayed in the area after the sale, renting a small house in town, and the 2 women became something like friends over the following years. An unlikely pairing. The county found almost as strange as the fish had once seemed, though by then the county had largely run out of energy for finding Nora strange about anything. Lucille would sometimes drive out on Sunday afternoons just to walk the old fence line where her husband's failed cotton had once stood, watching the same ground now produce something green and thriving under different management. And she told Nora once, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, that it helped more than she could properly explain, watching the land recover from the very thing that had broken her husband's heart in slow motion over those final 3 years. "I used to think the land just turned against him," Lucille said that afternoon, "like it had decided to punish him for something. Took me a long while watching what you've done with it to understand the land wasn't punishing anybody. It was just exhausted the same as he was, and neither one of them had anybody around who knew how to help them rest." There was a younger couple, the Mercers, who had inherited a farm already half ruined and chose wisely to sell early rather than spend a decade discovering what Birch had spent too. And there was old Silas Reddick, 90 years old, and the last living farmer in the county, who remembered Garland Cosgrove as a young man who sold not out of desperation, but out of a simple, clear-eyed understanding that his own sons had no interest in farming, and that Nora, more than anyone else left in the county, would treat the land the way his own father had once taught him land deserved to be treated. Silas told her something the day they signed the papers that she carried with her for the rest of her life, sitting in his cluttered front room surrounded by photographs of a family that had mostly scattered to cities far from the Delta. "I remember your daddy as a young man, Nora. Quiet even then. Watched everything, said almost nothing. I always figured he was thinking deeper thoughts than the rest of us, just never had the nerve to say them out loud. Looks like you finally said them for him." She had not cried during the entire process of acquiring his land, not once through all the paperwork and the practical negotiations. But she cried that afternoon, driving home the weight of 70 years of silence, finally finding its proper outlet in an old man's casual, generous observation. Pearl Atchison lived long enough to see most of it dying peacefully in her own bed at 91 two farms down, having outlived nearly every man who once laughed at the co-op. At her funeral, Nora stood near the back the way Pearl herself once had at her father's, and understood, watching the small gathering of mourners, that this was simply how it went. One generation watching the next, prove out an idea too slowly for the first to fully witness it, and being grateful anyway for whatever portion they got to see. If you were to visit that land today, you would find a woman well into her 70s, her hair the color of raw cotton, her hands still strong, still capable, still carrying the particular calluses of someone who never once stopped doing the work herself, regardless of how large the operation eventually grew. You would find her walking the ditches each morning, just as her father once had, except her gaze carries something his never quite managed to hold on to. Where his eyes had carried worry, hers carries something closer to quiet communion, the settled understanding of someone who spent a lifetime listening to a piece of ground until it finally fully told her everything it needed. She is often followed on these morning walks by her great-nephew, a quiet young man named Wade, who has her same patient eyes and her same instinct toward listening rather than speaking. He came to live with her at 19 after his own parents' distant relations, on her mother's side, decided college wasn't for him, and farm work might suit his temperament better, an arrangement that began as a favor to family and grew over several seasons into something neither of them had quite expected. He was clumsy with the pump at first, overcorrecting the flow rate the way young men tend to overcorrect everything, certain in the particular way of the young that more effort always meant better results. She let him make those mistakes too, the same way she had once been allowed to make her own, understanding that the lesson only stuck if the dirt itself was the one doing the teaching. She does not lecture him the way Dr. Tillery once lectured her, certain and condescending. She simply shows him. She has him crumble the rich dark soil between his fingers and feel for himself the difference between ground that is merely present and ground that is genuinely alive. She has him test the water at dawn and dusk, the same ritual her father once kept, the same ritual she has now kept for over 50 years without fail. Some evenings when the work is done and the light goes long and gold across fields that no longer remember being anything but fertile, the two of them sit on the same porch her father once built, and she tells him pieces of the story slowly, not all at once, the way you ration something precious, so it lasts as long as the person hearing it needs it to. "Why didn't you ever sell it like Mr. Ashworth wanted?" he asked her once, not long after he'd arrived, still young enough to find the refusal of easy money a little baffling. "Because the moment you sell an idea like this, people stop asking why it works," she told him. "They just buy the kit and wait for a miracle. And when the miracle doesn't come fast enough, because it never does fast, they give up and go back to the old way, telling themselves they tried the new thing and it failed. The land doesn't care how badly you want a shortcut, Wade. It only answers to patience. You can't put that in a bag and sell it. You can only live it long enough for somebody else to see it working and decide to try living it too." He thought about that a long while, the way he thought about most things she told him, slow and careful, and eventually nodded, and she understood, watching him, that the lesson had landed somewhere it would stay. There were harder lessons too, the kind that couldn't be taught through patience alone. The summer after his second year on the farm, a fungal blight swept through several fields downstream, unrelated to anything in their own system, but close enough to cause a brief frightened week, where Wade assumed the worst, certain the years of stability were finally about to collapse the way Birch's land once had. She found him at the head gate before dawn one morning, testing the water for the third time that week. his hands shaking slightly in a way that reminded her with an ache she hadn't expected of her own hands shaking at that same gate decades earlier. "It's not the same thing," she told him, crouching beside him at the water's edge. "Fear makes everything look like the same disaster wade. But this ground's been tested longer and harder than that blight could ever manage. Trust what you've already watched it survive." He looked at her for a long moment, something easing slightly in his face, though the worry didn't disappear entirely, not that morning, and not for several mornings after. It was she understood the same apprenticeship she had once served herself, learning the difference between genuine danger and inherited anxiety, a distinction that took years rather than seasons to fully master, and one she suspected he would still be refining long after she was gone. She still corresponds with Holt Abernathy now, a gray-haired professor at a university in California, the two of them having met in person only twice in over 50 years of letters, and yet she counts him without hesitation among the handful of people who understood her work most completely. His last letter, arriving only a few months ago, ended with a line she read aloud to Wade on the porch one evening, the two of them watching the sun go down gold and forgiving over fields that had once been pale ash and were now a deep, unbroken brown. "We spent our whole careers proving what a grieving young woman already knew the first night she opened her father's journals. I hope that comforts you as much as it humbles me." In the old farmhouse study on the desk where her father once sat writing by lamplight, his original journals remain exactly where he left them, their leather spines worn soft from decades of careful handling. Beside them now sits a second stack twice as tall, filled with her own meticulous handwriting. 50 years of rainfall, water temperature, soil composition, root structure, and the quiet daily discipline of listening that her father began and never lived to finish. One day she knows she will pass all of it to Wade, the way her father's question passed silently to her, on a night she still remembers with absolute clarity, sitting alone on the floor of that same study with a kerosene lamp burning low, and a single underlined sentence changing the entire direction of her life. The story of Nora Cosgrove is in the end a simple one, even if the years inside it were not. The men with the degrees and the polished shoes looked at her father's exhausted farm and saw a problem of inputs and outputs, a chemistry equation waiting to be solved with enough money and enough force. They told her again and again across 7 hard years to simply buy the answer to go into debt, the way every sensible person around her had already gone into debt, to stop fighting a battle that the entire weight of conventional wisdom insisted she could not win. Nora, guided only by the memory of a man who ran out of time before he could prove himself right, looked at the same exhausted farm and saw something entirely different. She saw a living system that had simply fallen out of balance, a partner that had been starved rather than failed, a question her father had been brave enough to ask and not quite brave enough to answer. She understood in a way none of the experts who mocked her ever managed to understand, that the solution was never a product waiting to be purchased. It was a process waiting to be nurtured season after patient season by someone willing to listen longer than anyone else around her was willing to wait. They laughed at her foolish fish for years. Some of them are still alive today watching her great-nephew Wade walk those same ditches at dawn, and they have long since stopped laughing. They never understood the real lesson buried underneath the mockery, the same lesson Garland Cosgrove tried and failed to prove in his own lifetime, and which his daughter finally carried across the finish line. He never got to see. The fish were only ever the beginning. The real transformation lived in the patience, in the daily unglamorous discipline of observation, in the profound, almost unreasonable belief that if you feed the land instead of forcing it, the land will remember exactly who fed it, and it will eventually, in its own quiet and undeniable way, feed you back. There is a photograph in the farmhouse now framed and hung in the hallway between the kitchen and the study, taken by the same young reporter who wrote the first article decades earlier, returning as an old man himself to do a follow-up piece on what had become by then one of the most studied small-scale regenerative operations in the entire region. The photograph shows Nora standing at the edge of the main ditch, Wade beside her, both of them looking not at the camera, but down at the water, the way people look at something they trust completely and have simply forgotten to perform for an audience. Beneath it, in her own handwriting on a small card she pinned there herself, is a single line, the same one underlined twice in her father's last journal. The question that started everything, in which she has long since stopped treating as a question at all. Could the water itself be the fertilizer? It could. It always could. It simply took someone patient enough and stubborn enough and grieving enough to find out.